Sometimes the most powerful stories begin in the quietest places. A cemetery on a rainy morning. The sound of tears falling on cold stone. Two strangers whose lives are about to collide in ways neither could have imagined. This is a story about family, about justice, about what happens when someone with unlimited money meets someone with unlimited determination. It's about discovering that the most dangerous weapon in the world isn't power or wealth, it's the truth. And sometimes, just sometimes, the truth has been waiting patiently for exactly the right moment to change everything. December in Seattle can break your heart. The rain doesn't just fall. It whispers secrets, carries sorrows, makes everything feel like the world is crying with you. On this particular morning, Margaret Sterling pulled her black Mercedes through the gates of Evergreen Cemetery, just like she had every month for the past 3 years. Margaret was what people called old money. 55 years old, perfectly dressed even in her grief, carrying herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about anything as common as rent or grocery bills. Sterling Corp was her empire, built over decades of ruthless business decisions and an iron will that had crushed every competitor who dared to challenge her. But here, in this place, she wasn't a billionaire. She was just a mother visiting her son. Nathan Sterling had been 28 when he died. Car accident, they said. One moment he was driving home from work. The next moment Margaret's world had crumbled into a million pieces. For 3 years, she had carried white lilies to his grave, the only flowers he had ever loved. For 3 years, she had stood there alone, talking to cold marble, wondering why life had taken the only person she had ever truly loved. Today was different. As Margaret approached Nathan's grave, her designer heels clicking on the wet stone path, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, kneeling before her son's tombstone, was a young woman in a diner uniform. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was holding a small child, a little boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. They were both crying. Not the polite, quiet tears of strangers paying respects. These were the deep, heartbroken sobs of people who had lost someone they loved. The kind of crying that comes from a place so deep inside you that it feels like your soul is breaking. Margaret felt her blood turn cold. In all her visits, in all her months of private grief, she had never seen these people. Who were they? What were they doing at Nathan's grave? "Excuse me," Margaret's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. She had perfected this tone in boardrooms across the country, cold, commanding, leaving no room for argument. "This is a private moment. You're in the wrong place." The young woman looked up, and Margaret saw a face marked by genuine grief. Her cheeks were stained with tears, but her eyes held something Margaret hadn't expected to find in a stranger at her son's grave. Dignity, strength, and something else, something that looked almost like recognition. "I'm sorry," the young woman said, her voice trembling but not backing down. I didn't know anyone was coming today." "Who are you?" Margaret demanded, every instinct she had honed in decades of business telling her something was very wrong here. "And why are you crying at my son's grave?" That's when the little boy looked up at her. Margaret Sterling had seen those eyes every day for 28 years. She had seen them light up on Christmas mornings, narrow in concentration over homework, flash with anger during teenage arguments, soften with love during their last conversation. She had seen them close forever in a hospital bed 3 years ago. Now she was seeing them again, bright and green and unmistakably familiar, in the face of a child who should not exist. The world seemed to tilt beneath Margaret's feet. Her hands began to shake around the lily stems. "My name is Carmen Rodriguez," the young woman said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand but never breaking eye contact. "And this is Marcus. I work at Rose's Diner downtown. I come here every month because—" She paused, looking down at the child with a love so fierce it was almost painful to witness. "Because Nathan was important to us." Important. The word echoed in Margaret's mind like a gunshot. How could her son have been important to people she had never met? She had investigated every detail of Nathan's life after his death, desperate to understand, to find meaning in her loss. There had been no serious relationships, no mention of children, no evidence that he had been living any kind of life she didn't know about. Important how? Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but the danger in it was unmistakable. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the headstones, turning the cemetery into a scene from a movie about broken dreams. But neither woman moved. They stood there, facing each other across Nathan's grave, while a 4-year-old boy with impossible eyes watched them both. Carmen Rodriguez took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her words changed everything. Because Marcus is his son, and because I promised someone very important to me that I would always protect him, no matter what happened. The bouquet slipped from Margaret's hands. White lilies scattered across the wet stone of Nathan's grave like fallen snow, like lost hopes, like the pieces of a life Margaret thought she understood. For 3 years, she had mourned believing that Nathan's death meant the end of the Sterling bloodline. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of knowing that everything she had built, everything she had fought for, would die with her because there was no one left to carry it forward. Now, standing in the rain, looking into the face of a child who had her son's eyes, Margaret realized that everything she thought she knew was wrong. But there was something else. Something in the way Carmen Rodriguez stood, in the careful way she chose her words, in the look that passed between her and the child. This wasn't the simple story of a grieving woman and an orphaned boy. There were layers here, secrets hidden beneath the surface like stones at the bottom of a deep, dark lake. Margaret Sterling had not become one of the most powerful women in the country by accepting simple explanations. And every instinct she had was screaming that Carmen Rodriguez was far more than she appeared to be. 2 weeks later, Margaret's private library looked like a war room. The elegant space, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and priceless first editions, had been transformed into a command center. Private investigator reports covered every surface of her antique mahogany desk. File folders thick with photographs, financial records, and surveillance reports were stacked in neat piles that represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in investigation fees. Margaret Sterling did not do anything halfway. When she wanted information, she got the best money could buy. Single mother, she muttered, scanning the reports with a focused intensity of a predator studying its prey. No known family. Works 60 hours a week at 2 different jobs just to keep food on the table. Lives in a 1-bedroom apartment in the worst part of Seattle where she probably hears gunshots more often than she hears birds singing. Her personal assistant, James Park, stood silently by her chair. In 20 years of working for Margaret, he had seen her destroy multinational corporations with less emotion than she was showing now. There was something different about this investigation. Something personal. Something that had gotten under her skin in a way that billion-dollar deals never had. What about the child's birth records? Margaret asked, her steel blue eyes fixed on a grainy surveillance photograph of Marcus playing alone on a rusted playground swing. That's where it gets interesting, James said, opening a separate folder with the careful precision of a man who had learned that Margaret Sterling did not tolerate sloppy work. We couldn't find a birth certificate. No hospital records. No official documentation about who gave birth to Marcus Rodriguez. It's as if his biological mother never existed. Margaret's fingers began their familiar drumming against the desk, a habit that had struck fear into the hearts of countless business rivals over the years. 3 years ago, when Nathan died, she had turned her grief into an obsession. She had hired the best investigators money could buy to examine every second of her son's life, desperate to find some meaning in his death, some clue about who he really was beneath the surface. She had found nothing. No secret relationships. No hidden life. No evidence that Nathan Sterling had been anything other than the dutiful son she thought she knew. Now she was discovering that she had been wrong about everything. Schedule a meeting, Margaret said, her voice carrying the cold finality of a judge delivering a sentence. With this Carmen Rodriguez. In my office. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock. She pronounced Carmen's name like it was a foreign word she was trying to taste. Something exotic and slightly distasteful. Sterling Corp headquarters rose 70 stories into the Seattle sky like a monument to power and ambition. The building's glass walls reflected the city below, creating the illusion that Margaret Sterling's empire was made of light itself, beautiful, untouchable, and blindingly bright. The next day, Carmen Rodriguez stood at the building's base, looking up at those gleaming windows, wearing her best and only business suit. She had bought it at a thrift store for $37, and she wore it like armor. Not expensive armor, but armor nonetheless. The lobby was designed to intimidate. Marble floors so polished they looked like mirrors. Artwork that cost more than most people made in a year. Security guards who looked like they had been hired from the Secret Service. Everything about the space whispered the same message: you don't belong here. But Carmen Rodriguez walked through it all with her head held high. The elevator ride to the 70th floor felt like ascending into heaven, or maybe into hell, depending on your point of view. When the doors opened, Carmen found herself facing floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Seattle that made the city look like a toy model spread out below. Margaret Sterling's office was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The desk was positioned so that visitors had to look up to make eye contact. The chairs were strategically placed lower than Margaret's throne-like executive seat. Even the lighting was calculated to put visitors at a disadvantage while keeping Margaret in the position of power. It was a game that had worked on world leaders, corporate titans, and government officials. Margaret had perfected the art of making people feel small before negotiations even began. "Please sit down," Margaret said, gesturing to the carefully positioned chair with a smile that never reached her eyes. Carmen looked at the chair, understanding exactly what it represented, and made a choice that surprised them both. "I'd prefer to stand, thank you." For just a moment, something flickered in Margaret's expression. Surprise, maybe, or perhaps the first hint of respect. "As you wish." Margaret opened a folder on her desk with the ceremony of a priest opening a sacred text. "I've researched you quite thoroughly, Miss Rodriguez. 2 jobs, no savings, living in conditions that most people would consider unsuitable for raising a pet, let alone a child." "Marcus is well cared for and deeply loved," Carmen replied, her voice calm and steady as a river flowing over stones. Margaret smiled, the kind of smile a shark might give a fish. "I'm sure you do your best. But a Sterling child deserves more than your best. He deserves the finest education money can buy, travel opportunities, cultural experiences, a future that matches his bloodline." "And what exactly are you suggesting?" Margaret slid a check across the polished surface of her desk like she was dealing cards in the world's most expensive poker game. $200,000. To start, Marcus comes to live with me, receives the education and opportunities he deserves, the future Nathan would have wanted for him. You can visit on weekends, of course. Supervised visits to ensure stability. Carmen stared at the check like it was a snake coiled to strike. "Are you trying to buy my son?" "He's not your son," Margaret said, and for the first time, the mask of civility began to slip from her face. "He's my grandson, my blood, my legacy. And frankly, a waitress in her 20s cannot provide what a family like the Sterlings can offer." Carmen laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only the bitter recognition of a truth she had expected but hoped she wouldn't hear. "Family," she said, and the word hung in the air between them like a challenge. "Margaret, may I call you Margaret? You want to talk about family?" "Marcus has called me Mom for 3 years. I'm the one who holds him when he has nightmares about monsters under the bed. I'm the one who teaches him to count using Cheerios at our kitchen table because we can't afford educational toys. I'm the one who reads him stories every night until he falls asleep feeling safe and loved. That's family." Margaret stood up, using her height to tower over Carmen like a mountain casting shadow over a valley. "Noble sentiments. But let's be realistic. You work like a slave just to afford rent in a neighborhood where police sirens are the soundtrack to daily life. Marcus deserves private schools where he'll learn from the best teachers money can hire. He deserves to see the world, to have opportunities you can't even imagine, let alone provide. And he deserves unconditional love," Carmen shot back. "Something you clearly failed to give your own son." The silence that followed was so complete that both women could hear the rain beginning to tap against the windows 70 floors above the city. Margaret Sterling felt like she had been slapped across the face. "How dare you?" "Nathan told me about you," Carmen continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but every word hit like a hammer blow. "He told me about the birthday parties where you sent expensive presents through your assistant because you were too busy with board meetings to show up yourself. He told me about the football games where he kept looking up at the empty seats in the parents' section, hoping you might surprise him just once. He told me about the graduation dinner where you spend the whole time on your phone closing some business deal while he sat there trying to tell you about his hopes and dreams." Margaret's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You don't know anything about me or my relationship with my son." "Maybe not," Carmen agreed. "But I knew Nathan. And I know exactly why he never told you about Marcus. He was protecting his son from becoming just another business transaction in your world." Carmen reached across the desk, picked up the check for $200,000, and tore it in half. The pieces fluttered to the floor like autumn leaves, like broken promises, like the remnants of a life Margaret thought she could control. Marcus isn't for sale. Not for 200,000. Not for 2 million. Not for all the money in your empire. Margaret's voice turned dangerous, dropping to the low, threatening tone that had made grown men resign from their positions rather than face her wrath. Then we'll do this the hard way. I have resources you can't even imagine, Miss Rodriguez. Lawyers who could argue that black is white and win. Investigators who could find dirt on a saint. Connections at every level of government who owe me favors. I can prove in any court in this country that a single mother with no education, living in poverty, is not in the best interests of the child. Carmen smiled for the first time since entering the office. It was a small smile, but there was something in it that made Margaret Sterling, a woman who had never backed down from any fight, feel the first cold touch of uncertainty. Margaret, Carmen said softly, you're making a very dangerous assumption. You're assuming that I'm just some poor waitress you can intimidate with your wealth and power. But there are things about me, about Marcus, about Nathan, that your expensive investigators haven't discovered yet. And when they do... She paused, letting the words hang in the air like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Well, let's just say that your investigators aren't quite as good as you think they are. Carmen walked toward the office door with the calm confidence of someone who held all the cards in a game Margaret didn't even know she was playing. At the door, she turned back one final time. And Margaret, the next time you want to discuss Marcus, it will be on my terms, not yours. 3 days later, Margaret Sterling received a phone call that turned her world upside down. Robert Thornton had been her lawyer for 20 years. His firm, Thornton & Associates, was known for winning cases that other lawyers wouldn't even touch. Robert had helped Margaret destroy competitors, navigate hostile takeovers, and crush anyone who dared to challenge Sterling Corp's dominance. He had never sounded nervous before. Today, his voice was shaking. Margaret, we need to talk about the custody case. What about it? Margaret was reviewing quarterly profit reports while she talked, multitasking with the efficiency of someone who had turned ruthlessness into an art form. File the papers. Use whatever resources you need. I want that child. That's just it, Robert said, and Margaret could hear him swallowing hard on the other end of the line. Miss Rodriguez has hired legal representation. Margaret laughed, the sound sharp as broken glass. With what money? Some overworked public defender who graduated bottom of his class from a community college law program. Actually, Robert paused, and in that silence, Margaret felt the first whisper of something she had never experienced before, fear. It's Morrison, Bennett and Pierce. The quarterly reports slipped from Margaret's hands, scattering across her office floor. Morrison, Bennett and Pierce wasn't just a law firm. It was a legal superpower. They specialized in civil rights cases and had never, not once in their 50-year history, lost a major court battle. They were the firm that took on governments and won. They were the legal team that made billionaires sweat and corporations tremble. They were also known for being extremely selective about their cases and charging fees that made Margaret's expensive lifestyle look modest by comparison. That's impossible, Margaret whispered. Why would they be interested in some waitress? I don't know, but there's more, Robert continued, and his voice was getting smaller with every word. They've already filed a preventive petition claiming that any attempt to remove the child from Miss Rodriguez's custody would constitute kidnapping based on socioeconomic discrimination. They are arguing that your wealth and power don't give you the right to destroy a loving family just because you can afford better lawyers. Margaret slammed the phone down so hard it cracked the receiver. For the first time in her life, someone had outplayed her. Carmen Rodriguez, a waitress who lived in a one-bedroom apartment and worked 60 hours a week just to survive, had somehow secured the best legal representation money could buy. How was that possible? More importantly, what else didn't Margaret know about the woman who was raising her grandson? As Margaret sat in her office, surrounded by scattered financial reports and the broken pieces of her assumption that money could solve everything, she began to realize that she wasn't fighting just a custody battle. She was at war. And for the first time in her life, Margaret Sterling wasn't sure she was going to win. The storm was gathering. In a modest apartment across town, Carmen Rodriguez was making phone calls to people Margaret Sterling had never heard of. People who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this moment. People who had been preparing for a battle that Margaret didn't even know was coming. Because sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who look like they have nothing to lose. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon in the world isn't money or influence. Sometimes, it's simply the truth. But Margaret Sterling was about to learn that some truths are worth waiting for. And some people are willing to sacrifice everything to make sure those truths finally see the light of day. The phone call that would destroy Margaret Sterling's empire came on a Monday morning when the Seattle rain was falling like tears from heaven. But before we talk about Margaret's downfall, we need to understand who Carmen Rodriguez really was. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. While Margaret Sterling was making frantic phone calls to her lawyers and investigators, trying to understand how a waitress had outmaneuvered her, something very different was happening in Carmen's modest apartment across town. The living room was small and humble, second-hand furniture, a television that was older than Marcus, walls that needed painting. But on this particular evening, that humble space was filled with some of the most powerful people Margaret Sterling had never heard of. Dr. Michael Chen sat at the tiny kitchen table, his briefcase open, revealing thick folders full of documents that would make any corporate lawyer nervous. He was a professor of law at the University of Washington, but more importantly, he was known as the man who had helped bring down 3 major corporations for civil rights violations. Sarah Martinez was typing on her laptop in the corner, her fingers moving with the speed of someone who had spent years chasing down corruption stories. She was an investigative journalist for the Seattle Tribune, and her exposés on corporate crime had sent more than one billionaire to prison. But at the center of it all was a woman Margaret Sterling would have dismissed as just another person if she had passed her on the street. Elena Rodriguez was in her 50s, elegantly dressed but not expensively, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see through everything. "Aunt Elena," Carmen said, embracing the woman with the kind of love reserved for family. "Thank you for flying up from Los Angeles. I know you cancelled important meetings to be here." Elena smiled, and in that smile was the same fire that had burned in Carmen's eyes when she faced down Margaret Sterling in that boardroom. "My dear child, when you called me and said the time had finally come, I would have cancelled meetings with the president himself. We've been waiting for this moment for 3 years." Marcus was playing on the floor with his toy cars, completely unaware that the adults around him were planning something that would change his life forever. In his innocent world, these were just Mom's friends having boring grown-up conversations. He had no idea they were preparing for war. Dr. Chen opened his briefcase and spread documents across the table like a general planning a battle. "Carmen, are you absolutely certain you want to do this? Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Margaret Sterling has resources that most small countries would envy. She won't hesitate to use every weapon in her arsenal." Carmen picked up Marcus, holding him close as she answered. "Dr. Chen, I've been preparing for this moment every single day since Nathan died. Every night class I've taken at Seattle University. Every law book I've studied until 3 in the morning while Marcus slept. Every contact I've cultivated, every piece of evidence I've gathered, it's all been leading to this." Sarah looked up from her laptop, her eyes bright with the excitement of a hunter who had finally cornered her prey. "The evidence you've collected is extraordinary, Carmen. 3 years of meticulous documentation of Sterling Corp's illegal business practices. Bribes to city council members to get construction permits. Systematic wage theft from their lowest-paid workers. Environmental violations that they've covered up by paying off inspectors. It's enough to destroy any company, no matter how powerful." Elena walked to the small window that looked out over the modest neighborhood where Carmen and Marcus lived. Down below, children played in a park that needed new equipment, in a community that had been forgotten by people like Margaret Sterling. "Margaret thinks her money makes her untouchable," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 years teaching business law at UCLA. "She has no idea that my niece has spent the last 3 years becoming an expert on every illegal deal Sterling Corp has ever made. Every tax dodge, every bribed official, every worker they've cheated, Carmen knows it all. Aunt Elena is the one who taught me the most important lesson of my life," Carmen explained to Dr. Chen and Sarah. "She taught me that knowledge is the only weapon they can never buy from you, never steal from you, never take away. And she taught me that sometimes, to protect the people you love, you have to be willing to fight battles that take years to win." That's when Carmen's phone rang. The caller ID showed Margaret Sterling's name, and everyone in the room could hear the fury in Margaret's voice even before Carmen put the call on speaker. "What kind of game are you playing?" Margaret screamed, her composure completely shattered. Morrison, Bennett and Pierce? How does a waitress get lawyers like that? Carmen looked around the room at her allies, her real family, and smiled with the calm confidence of someone who had been planning this conversation for 3 years. Margaret, I warned you that there were things about me you hadn't discovered yet. I don't care what kind of tricks you're using. Marcus is my grandson, and I have unlimited resources to get what I want. Unlimited resources. Carmen's voice was as steady as a rock in a storm. Margaret, you're making the same mistake that powerful people always make. You think money is the only kind of power that matters. But what if I told you there's something much more powerful than all your wealth? And what would that be? The truth. Margaret's laughter came through the phone like the sound of breaking glass. Truth doesn't pay for expensive lawyers, sweetheart. You're absolutely right, Carmen agreed, and everyone in the room leaned forward, knowing this was the moment they had all been waiting for. But the truth about your illegal business dealings, the truth about how you built your empire through fraud, bribery, and systematic corruption, that kind of truth is worth more than money to certain people. The silence on the other end of the phone was so complete they could have heard a pin drop. You're bluffing, Margaret finally said, but her voice had lost all its previous confidence. Sarah Martinez from the Seattle Tribune is sitting right here, Carmen said, handing the phone to the investigative reporter. I think she'd like to speak with you. Good afternoon, Miss Sterling, Sarah said, her voice professional and deadly calm. I'm putting the finishing touches on an investigative series about questionable corporate practices in Seattle. I'd love to give you the opportunity to comment on the allegations we've documented about Sterling Corporation. Margaret hung up so fast they could practically hear the phone breaking. Elena smiled with the pride of a teacher whose student had just graduated with honors. Carmen, you've learned your lessons well. Your mother would be so proud of you right now. Aunt Elena raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 16, Carmen explained to the others. She taught me that it doesn't matter where you start in life. What matters is where you're determined to go. And she taught me that sometimes, the only way to protect what you love is to be willing to sacrifice everything for it. Dr. Chen was packing up his briefcase, satisfied that everything was in place. The legal strategy is rock solid. We have dozens of precedent cases where courts have ruled that attempts to remove children based purely on economic status constitute discrimination. Margaret Sterling's money doesn't give her the right to destroy a loving family. And I have enough evidence of corporate crimes to keep Margaret busy with federal investigators for the next decade, Sarah added, closing her laptop with the satisfaction of someone who had just loaded the most powerful weapon in journalism, the truth. Carmen sat down in her old armchair, Marcus falling asleep in her arms. And for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten, hope. What Margaret Sterling doesn't understand, Carmen said softly, is that this was never just about a custody battle. This is about justice for every worker Sterling Corp has cheated. This is about justice for every family they've destroyed with their greed. This is about making sure that Marcus grows up in a world where being rich doesn't automatically make you right. Monday morning, November 15th, was the day Margaret Sterling's world ended. She woke up to 37 missed calls on her phone, which was unusual but not unheard of for someone who ran a multinational corporation. But when she saw her assistant James standing outside her bedroom door, holding a tablet computer with an expression of pure terror on his face, she knew something was catastrophically wrong. Margaret, James said, his voice shaking like he had just witnessed the end of the world, you need to see this. Right now. The headline on the Seattle Tribune's website filled the entire screen in letters so large they seemed to be shouting. Empire built on corruption. Leaked documents reveal decades of crimes at Sterling Corporation. Margaret felt her legs give out beneath her. She sat down hard on her bed, staring at the screen as her entire life collapsed in real time. Below the headline were dozens of photographs of documents she was certain no one had ever seen. Contracts with shell companies that existed only on paper. Bank transfers to offshore accounts that were supposed to be secret. Recorded conversations she was sure had been private. Email chains discussing bribes to city officials as casually as most people discuss the weather. Every illegal deal she had ever made. Every corner she had ever cut. Every law she had ever broken. All of it was there, displayed for the world to see like evidence at a murder trial. How? Margaret whispered, scrolling through page after page of her own crimes. How did they get all this? Her phone was ringing constantly now. James answered it with trembling hands. "It's Robert Thornton," he said, his face pale as death. Margaret grabbed the phone. Her lawyer's voice was hollow, defeated. "Margaret, it's over. The IRS has issued search warrants for your home and offices. The FBI is probably already on their way to your house. The Securities and Exchange Commission has suspended all trading of Sterling Corp stock. Your bank accounts have been frozen pending investigation." Margaret dropped the phone and ran to her computer, frantically typing in passwords to her bank accounts. Access denied. Access denied. Access denied. In the span of one morning, she had gone from being one of the wealthiest women in America to having less money available than Marcus probably had in his piggy bank. She called Carmen Rodriguez with hands that were shaking so hard she could barely dial the numbers. "You did this!" Margaret screamed when Carmen answered, her voice raw with rage and desperation. "You destroyed my life. How could you do this to me?" "Good morning, Margaret," Carmen replied, her voice as calm and peaceful as a Sunday morning. "I imagine you've had a chance to read the news. I'll destroy you. I'll use every resource I have to." "What resources?" Carmen interrupted gently. "Because according to what I'm watching on the news right now, your bank accounts were frozen about 20 minutes ago." Margaret looked at the television in her bedroom. There, on live TV, were news reporters standing in front of Sterling Corp headquarters while employees walked out carrying cardboard boxes, their careers destroyed overnight. The building that had been her monument to power now looked like a crime scene. "Margaret," Carmen continued, "there's something my investigators forgot to mention earlier. Sarah Martinez doesn't work alone. She has an entire team that specializes in financial crimes. Every illegal document you've signed in the past 20 years has been photographed, verified, and turned over to federal authorities." "Why?" Margaret asked, and for the first time in decades, her voice cracked with genuine pain. "Why would you do this to me? What did I ever do to you?" "You never asked about Marcus's mother," Carmen said simply. "If you had, you would have learned that her name was Maria Sterling." Margaret's blood turned to ice in her veins. The name hit her like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Maria was the daughter of your cousin Daniel Sterling. The same Daniel Sterling you betrayed in 1995 when you forged documents to steal his share of the family company." The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. Daniel, young and trusting, signing papers he thought would make them equal partners. The family meeting where Margaret had accused him of stealing from the company. Accusations based on documents she had falsified herself. The way Daniel had been cast out of the family in disgrace, taking nothing with him but his wounded pride and his infant daughter. "Maria grew up poor because of what you did to her father," Carmen continued, her voice steady as a judge delivering a verdict. "She met Nathan in college. They fell in love, but she was terrified to tell him who she really was. She knew that if you discovered Daniel Sterling's daughter was dating your son, you would destroy their relationship just like you had destroyed her family." Margaret remembered Daniel mentioning a daughter before he disappeared from their lives. She had never given the child a second thought. "When Maria died giving birth to Marcus, Nathan came to me in desperation. I was Maria's best friend, her only family after what you did to her father. Nathan knew Maria wanted me to raise Marcus if anything ever happened to her. But Nathan also discovered the truth about what you had done to Maria's family all those years ago." "Nathan knew," Margaret whispered. "He spent the last 6 months of his life investigating you, Margaret, gathering evidence of your crimes, documenting every illegal deal, every bribe, every law you had broken. When he died in that car accident, he left everything to me. Documents, recordings, bank records, everything I needed to bring you down. He made me promise to wait for the right moment." Margaret heard heavy footsteps on the stairs outside her bedroom. Authoritative voices calling out, "FBI, we have a warrant." "The accident," Margaret said, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "It wasn't an accident," Carmen said quietly. "Nathan had uncovered a money laundering scheme involving some very dangerous people. People you had hired to solve problems that legal methods couldn't handle. When Nathan threatened to expose everything, they made sure he couldn't. They killed your own son, Margaret, because of the criminal empire you built." The truth hit Margaret like a sledgehammer to the chest. Nathan had died because he had tried to do the right thing. Her own greed, her own crimes, had put her son in danger. She had killed Nathan as surely as if she had been driving the other car. Marcus is the last legitimate Sterling, Carmen continued. Maria was the rightful heir to the fortune you stole from her father. Now that all your illegal assets have been seized, Marcus will finally inherit what was always rightfully his family's. The door to Margaret's bedroom burst open. Federal agents in bulletproof vests filled the room, their weapons drawn, their voices commanding. Margaret Sterling, you are under arrest for tax evasion, money laundering, bribery, fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Margaret heard Carmen's voice one last time through the phone that had fallen to the floor. Marcus will grow up knowing the truth about his family. He'll know that justice sometimes takes years to arrive, but it always comes eventually. And he'll know that his father died trying to do the right thing. The cameras were waiting outside. Margaret Sterling, who had spent her life avoiding scandal, was walked out of her mansion in handcuffs while news helicopters circled overhead like vultures. The empire she had built through lies and corruption crumbled in a single morning, broadcast live to millions of people who had never heard of her before and would never forget her now. 2 years later, the Washington State Women's Correctional Center was about as far from a penthouse office as it was possible to get. Margaret Sterling, prisoner number 47291, worked 8 hours a day in the prison laundry for $2.50 an hour, less money than she used to spend on a single cup of coffee. The orange uniform was a far cry from the designer suits she had once worn to intimidate competitors. The shared cell was smaller than the closet in her former master bedroom. The cafeteria food was probably worse than anything Marcus had ever eaten, even when Carmen was struggling to feed him on a waitress's salary. But Margaret had learned something in prison that all her wealth had never taught her: humility. "Sterling, you have a visitor," the guard announced one Tuesday afternoon. Margaret expected to see her former lawyer, maybe a journalist wanting to interview the fallen billionaire. Instead, she found Carmen Rodriguez sitting in the visiting room, wearing an elegant navy blue suit that probably cost more than Margaret now earned in 6 months. Carmen looked successful, confident, happy. Everything Margaret had once been but had never truly felt. "I came to bring you news about Marcus," Carmen said, her voice kind but not apologetic. "He's been accepted to Phillips Academy, the same boarding school Nathan attended. Full academic scholarship." Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years: pride. Not the cold satisfaction of a business victory, but the warm, genuine pride of a grandmother hearing about her grandson's success. "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret asked. "Because you're his grandmother. And because Marcus asked me a question last week that I thought you should know about. He asked me if bad people can become good people." Carmen paused, studying Margaret's face. "I told him that it depends on whether they really want to change." Carmen opened a folder and spread photographs across the table between them. Marcus in his school uniform, smiling brightly at the camera. Marcus playing violin in what looked like a concert hall. Marcus reading a book under a tree in what was obviously the yard of a beautiful home. He's learning violin, just like his father did. His teacher says he has natural talent. Carmen's voice was soft with maternal pride. "He's happy, Margaret. Really, truly happy. How can you afford all this?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The courts returned Daniel Sterling's rightful share of the family fortune to his heir, Marcus. With interest and penalties, it turned out to be worth quite a lot more than what you stole all those years ago. Carmen smiled with genuine satisfaction. "It's ironic, isn't it? You spent your whole life accumulating wealth through crime. And in the end, the only Sterling money that was truly legitimate was the money that should have gone to the family you destroyed." Margaret closed her eyes, finally understanding the complete picture of what had happened to her. "And you?" she asked quietly. "What did you get out of all this?" Carmen's answer was simple and devastating. "I got the chance to give Marcus what you never gave Nathan, a family that puts love before money, that values character over wealth, that measures success by how much joy we bring to each other's lives instead of how much we can take from others." She stood up, preparing to leave. "And I got the peace of knowing that Maria and Nathan can finally rest. They both died because of the corruption in your world, but their son will grow up in a different kind of world entirely." "Marcus," Margaret said softly. Is he happy?" "He's loved," Carmen replied. "Completely, unconditionally, genuinely loved. And that's all any child really needs. While Margaret sat in her prison cell that night, thinking about the grandmother she might have been, Marcus Rodriguez Sterling was running through the gardens of his new home, a comfortable house overlooking Lake Washington, purchased not with criminal money but with a legitimate inheritance that had finally been returned to its rightful family. Carmen watched from the porch, her law degree hanging proudly on the wall behind her. Not the degree of someone who had worked nights and weekends for 3 years while planning the downfall of a corrupt empire, but simply the degree of a woman who had learned that education truly is the one thing no one can ever take away from you. "Mom!" Marcus called out, running toward the house with his violin case in one hand and a huge smile on his face. "Can I play the new song I learned for you?" "Of course, my love," Carmen replied, thinking about how proud Nathan would be if he could see his son now. Elena Rodriguez visited regularly from Los Angeles, sharing stories about Marcus's heritage that filled him with pride instead of shame. He would grow up knowing that his family had fought for justice, not revenge. That even when the world seems unfair, there's always a way to make things right if you're patient enough and determined enough to wait for the perfect moment. Margaret had tried to buy a grandson, only to discover that family cannot be purchased. It can only be built through love, presence, and the daily choice to put someone else's well-being before your own success. Carmen's real victory wasn't destroying Margaret Sterling. It was creating a future where Marcus would never have to choose between love and money, where Child would grow up knowing that his worth wasn't measured by his bank account, but by the strength of his character and the depth of his compassion for others. Margaret Sterling learned, too late, that true power doesn't come from how much you can take from others, but from how much you're willing to give to the people you love. She had confused wealth with worth, dominance with strength, fear with respect. Carmen Rodriguez proved that persistence and intelligence will always triumph over arrogance and prejudice. That sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't force or money, but simply the patience to wait for the perfect moment to tell the truth. And sometimes, just sometimes, that truth is worth waiting 3 years to reveal. This story reminds us that true family is built with love, not money. That justice may be delayed, but it never truly dies. And that the most dangerous person in any room might just be the one everyone thinks has nothing to lose, because those are the people who are willing to sacrifice everything to protect what they love most. In the end, Marcus Rodriguez Sterling grew up knowing that his family had chosen love over greed, truth over power, and justice over revenge. And that, perhaps, is the greatest inheritance any child could ever receive.